Okay, we are back. We had some technical difficulties there with the internet service provider, but we're back with Professor John Schaff, and we were discussing. We ended this before we got cut off. We were talking about. I wanted to talk about the executive orders for a moment. President Trump received a lot of praise from his supporters because he seemed to deliver on a lot of the promises that he made in 2016. However, some of the promises made are done through executive orders, which we don't find anywhere in the Constitution as having any validity, nor in the state constitutions for executive orders holding any validity. They are, in fact, they have the force of law, which is exclusively the responsibility of the legislative branch. So although people may be happy with the executive orders that President Trump was able to get through now, the tide has turned. Now Joe Biden is going to be giving executive orders, and we see that he wants to reinstate the Paris Peace Agreement or the Paris Accord, climate Accord. Agreement. Yep. He wants to reinstate the Iran deal, which is both of these, incidentally, both of those acts were completely unconstitutional, started by the Obama administration, totally unconstitutional. They needed to get senatorial verification and approval, and they didn't on either end of those two. So now we have executive orders that are going to work in the opposite direction. That's why it's important for Republicans not to be so excited, so excited about executive orders, because they're not constitutional for one thing, and they will turn around and bite you perhaps in the next election cycle is the other thing. What do you think about that, Professor?
Well, there's the constitutional justification for executive orders is, the president is the chief executive of the executive branch and has the right to direct the executive branch to do what he will. And so that's the justification for it. The problem we have in our day is that we've seen two things happen. One, the number of executive orders, now we should probably use a broader term, executive actions, because not all these things are per se executive orders. That's a legal distinction, but I'll use the generic term executive order. We're using them a lot more than we used to, and the kinds of things that are done with executive orders are different. Now, for example, Teddy Roosevelt used a lot of executive orders to set aside public lands for parks and national forests, that sort of thing. But now what we see in our day is a lot of public policy, things that we would normally recognize as having a sort of legislative basis, are now done through executive order. Now, the upside or the downside, depending on how you look at it, is that they are easily changed, because once the president, as we're going to see on January 20, once we get a president of a different party in, they can just they can rescind whatever they want to rescind and write what they want to write. And so the problem with this is that, again, we make important policy decisions, like when President Obama redefined the status of all sorts of immigrants on the stroke of a pen instead of going through normal legislation. Or you're talking about things that we would normally think of as treaty powers with Paris and with Iran, with the Paris Accords and with Iran, that would normally needed Senate approval, and we didn't go that route. Or even things like when President Trump expends money to build a wall on the southern border, whatever the validity of that as policy, normally that would take legislation, and he just does it. And the problem, it sort of goes back to who knows what people heard when we had our internet glitch. But I was talking about that idea that we put way too much emphasis on the presidency and expect more of the president than the president can actually deliver. And so we want, well, let's let the president do this stuff, because going through Congress is too much of a pain in the rear end, and it takes too long, and you have to compromise. But of course, that's the whole underpinning of our system, is that when we go through a Congress which represents a multitude of interests, what we have is we have give and take, we have compromise, we have conciliation and moderation, and from there we get better public policy. And the whole point of going through Congress is that we don't just want the sense of the people, but the deliberative sense of the people. We want it to be thoughtful. And if the president can just do things by the stroke of a pen, that's not deliberation. And so you have the possibility of bad legislation, or this, bad orders being manifested, but it also it distorts our constitutional order when a president can do something that is quasi-legislative at least and make really important public policy decisions based on simply the stroke of a pen instead of going through a process where multiple interests are represented.
It's very true. And it's interesting to note, Professor, that the Emancipation Proclamation was indeed an executive order.
Yep.
So that was probably the greatest executive order in American history. However, there isn't enumerated language in the Constitution that talks about the executive orders. The executive orders started with George Washington's administration, and he would give executive orders to those who were within the executive administration. Of course, as you've talked about and brought it out before us, it's been abused to a far greater degree, and it's another example of progressivism. And I think an interesting observation that we can make now that the election is over is the fact that these unrealistic expectations of a president clearly seen in attributing the pandemic problems to Donald Trump, to President Trump, and his handling of it. And I believe that it was very unfair to place so much responsibility on him. But the Democrats were effective in getting to the voters in many respects and proving to them, or attempting to prove to them, that Donald Trump's handling of the pandemic could have been the thing that really cost him the most votes, or the issue rather that could have cost him the most votes. And it was all derivative of the unrealistic expectations of a president. You know, Joe Biden talked about, well, he doesn't have a plan. He doesn't have a plan. I mean, Trump did exactly what any man would do in stopping the flow of people coming from China to begin with, to start quarantining. But to lay the blame for the hundreds of thousands that have died in the pandemic, unfortunately, upon Trump and his actions is grossly unfair. And it was exploited for political expedience on behalf of Joe Biden. I think it was the major reason why he got elected. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think you're probably right. You know, I often use a football analogy when talking about the president. The president is sort of like the quarterback of the football team. He gets too much credit when things go right and too much blame when things go bad.
Yes.
And that's just sort of how it is. It's sort of what you sign up for when you get the most important role. Then we can assess whether that's fair. And I think it is indicative of how things went, that in the end, I think he'd be hard pressed to get Joe Biden to say what exactly he would have really done differently than President Trump, other than set a different tone. I think a different tone might have been a good idea, but as a matter of public policy, I don't know that a different tone would have saved anybody's life. And I think, as you say, I think there really isn't, as a matter of policy, much that the president could have done that he didn't do. They stopped travel from China. They gave PPE and ventilators to whoever needed it. We passed a big COVID relief bill. The president signed it. The president got the Operation Warp Speed, which, a week after the election, who knows? It looks like we might have a vaccine. And so they facilitated, through easing of FDA regulations and putting some money behind research, they facilitated vaccine research. I don't know precisely what else on the federal level the federal government could have done, but you're right that Biden and the Democrats did a good job of framing it. And so I think the polling seems to show that if we can talk about polling these days, but these numbers are so big, I think that even if they're off by a bit, it's still fair enough that the number one issue, the plurality of voters picked COVID as the number one issue, not a majority, but a plurality listed COVID as the number one issue that drove their vote. And it looks like Biden probably won that vote about 70-30 on that. So even that poll is a bad poll, like a lot of the polls were. It's not bad by 40 points. And so clearly, probably you're right that what set Joe Biden over the top was in a very close election was probably this COVID thing. Though, in a close election, there are 1,000 reasons why someone wins and someone loses, but this is probably number one, would be the perception that Trump did not handle the pandemic very well, whether that's accurate or not.
Yeah, another irony too, before we move on to the book, Professor, is the fact that a lot of the states that flipped from voting for Trump in 2016 over to Biden this year are run by Democrats, and the Democratic governors were the ones who imposed draconian measures, executive orders, if you will, in shutting down the economies to these states. Prior to the pandemic, the economy was very good. Of course, Donald Trump promoted a healthy economic environment. Probably the most important thing that he did was to get through, and what he pushed for and leading was the corporate tax rate reduction, which was very important. It really galvanized the stock market, it galvanized manufacturing and business. So it's really unfortunate that a lot of the decisions, rather, that some of the Democratic governors made actually shed, or they applied in a bad light to Trump, which really wasn't his fault at all. It was the decisions that the Democratic governors made. But I want to get to our.
Go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Go. Let's move on to the book. I could talk about the election all day. So let's get on to Lincoln.
Right. So now what we're talking about, and I want to go back to the first chapter. I told you I can't get out of this first chapter because it's so important. It sets the foundation for what we're looking for. So we're talking about statesmanship. What is statesmanship? And I want to read to the audience the first paragraph so that we can set the context, and then I want you to elaborate on it. But it says here in the first chapter, of the common complaints in contemporary American politics is the lack of statesmanship on the part of political leadership. Governed by polls and petty partisanship, our politicians cannot rally the American people to a common purpose. Rarely in contemporary political discourse do elected officials make a good faith appeal to those that they disagree, choosing instead to preach to the converted. This is a problem, as our political rhetoric is thus dominated by language destined to highlight differences rather than bring about conciliation. It is not a surprise, then, that polarization and tribalism are on the rise. Part of our frustration is caused by lack of understanding of fundamental qualities of the statesman. Mm-hmm. Two central political ideals that govern the statesman are prudence and moderation, but our contemporary political discourse tends to degenerate or misunderstand these two grand principles. And of course, go through again and explain what prudence is and what moderation is. We have, especially with moderation, we have a misunderstanding of what that really means.
Okay, so we talked about this a little bit last time. Remember, prudence is using the right means to achieve a good end. So it assumes you have a good end, but then how do you achieve that end? And so it doesn't do you any good to have all sorts of great ideals if you don't know how to bring those ideals into reality. Then moderation we defined as having all good things, or each good thing, in the proper amount. So there's a sense there of balance. And so using the American context, we have goods like rule of law, consent of the governed, natural rights, which we'll talk about a little bit today, equality, liberty. And sometimes these things come into conflict. And so the moderate statesman knows when to move a little bit this way, when to move a little bit that way, when to emphasize this, when to emphasize that, and to give each of the good things its due. And so these are the tools of the statesman. And then that statesman, the critique of the poll-driven politician, and we live in a democracy, you can't get away from public opinion, but the statesman has to some degree lead public opinion, and to be looking further ahead than simply the next election. We define statesmanship as the politician is someone who looks out for the next election. The statesman is someone who looks out for the next generation. And so I mean, you take, just look at, I noticed this in the past week since the election, is we see a poll right now that something like 70% of Republicans believe that the election was stolen. Now, I think there was probably some irregularities, even illegalities, but just without going through all the details, I don't think the election was stolen. Although I'm not unsympathetic with those who want an investigation. In fact, I'm all for investigations. If there's illegality and if fraud changed any results, then we need to find that out. But my only point is that 4 years ago, 70% of Democrats thought that Russians colluded with Donald Trump to steal an election. Much like, about 10 years ago, about 70% of Republicans said that they believed that Barack Obama was actually a Muslim from Kenya. And about 15 years ago, about 70% of Democrats said that George W. Bush had prior knowledge of 9/11. Now, I actually believe that most of those 70% I'm talking about don't actually believe what they say that they believe. It's their way of saying, I don't like this person, and I'm going to express even a horrid or even a ridiculous opinion, like George Bush had prior knowledge of the 9/11 attacks. I don't think most Democrats actually believe that. They just hated Bush so much they were willing to tell that to a pollster. Nor do I think a majority of Republicans thought that Barack Obama was secretly a Muslim from Kenya, but they were willing to say so to a pollster as their way of saying, I don't like this guy. And that's the kind of polarization that we need to overcome. And while obviously we want to pay attention to public opinion, I just said one of the goods we're looking at is consent to the governed, right? We want to pay attention to the will of the people. But if we're only paying attention to the immediate will of the people, which is all a poll can tell me is what the people believe right now. My point in studying these polls is people believe different things at different times, depending on what they hear and what they think the pollster wants to say and what mood I'm in today and what I saw on Tucker Carlson last night or what I saw on the Today Show this morning. I might change my opinion. And so you really can't be poll driven because polls are sort of in the wind. So you need to have a firmer hand. If I can mix my metaphors, you have to have a firmer hand on your ideological rudder and try to look not what's going to get me through today's 24-hour news cycle, which these days is like a 15-second news cycle with Twitter. But what's going to, can we look forward 2, 4, 10 years, and what's public policy going to mean? As I say, not just for the next election, but for the next generation. And that requires a certain kind of character in our politicians, a certain kind of statesmanship. So we have to think about how we cultivate that and how we can bring about some of these qualities that we want out of our statesmen.
Yes, and you actually talk about in the book that the polls drive too much policy. Polls are based upon passion, emotion, and this is the opposite of prudence and moderation in coming up with ideas. But what you say in the book is that the career of Abraham Lincoln, perhaps America's greatest statesman, shows how his political philosophy and political activity embodies these virtues of prudence and moderation. It is part of Lincoln's prudence and moderation, make him an object of persistent fascination, which of course he is to us. But Lincoln wished as much as possible, and this is a quote from your book, Lincoln wished as much as possible to win enemies over his friends. How does and how else does one succeed politically? And of course, Donald Trump could have used that advice earlier. He also saw the need for the democratic statesman, and that's small d democratic. He saw the need for the democratic statesman to temper his rhetoric, to soothe rather than stoke the passions of the people and of himself, should the desire for power tempt him to tyranny. Very important point.
Yep. Because if I'm only driven by polls, right, what that means is that then I have an incentive to whip up the people's passions, right? What have we seen? What we continually see in our election cycles is we talk about base-driven elections, that The job of the Republican candidate and of the Democratic candidate is to turn out the base. And the way you turn out the base is by whipping up passion. And so it's sad but true. I think we've discussed this before, that people are often more motivated by negativity, by what they're afraid of, than what their hopes are, what their aspirations are. But if the key to me winning is simply driving my own party's turnout instead of thinking about how do I convince people to disagree, then it's an incentive to play to passion instead of reason, instead of making arguments. And if we're going to remain at least somewhat united as a people, we've got to be able to talk to people on the other side and make some kind of effort to speak to people who disagree with us. That I think if you look at the rhetoric of Abraham Lincoln, over and over, he's making overtures to people who disagree with them, or especially people who don't 100% agree with them. Maybe they would agree with them a little bit, right? But he's saying, okay, here's how I can get you on my side. Here's how sometimes it might mean that Lincoln was silent on some things that he thought were secondary that would cause division within, say, the anti-slavery movement. Sometimes it was, let me recognize at least some of the justice in this point of view of people who are on our side, to maybe win them over to our side, and to try to show that he wasn't ideological. He wasn't just simply going to take the most extreme anti-slavery idea and cram it down the throats of the American people, dang public opinion and dang the rule of law. And so you can see in how he acted as president, but I think especially in his rhetoric, the way to avoid extreme appeals and to try to make sure that he was putting together a coalition of people who didn't agree on anything, but he wanted to show them that we agree enough on certain core things that we should put aside our disagreements and unite, and we can win elections. And they had failed to do that, the Republican Party, in 1856. And a lot of what happened between 1856 and 1860 was how the Republican Party was going to put together a slightly bigger coalition that they could win an election. Of course, that was successful, albeit the 1860 election is a bit goofy. But nonetheless, they were successful.
Right. Now, I would argue too, Professor, that the Republican Party failed to build the coalition in 2020. And it was because it became a cult of personality revolving around Trump. And it wasn't based upon principles, and it wasn't based upon historically Republican ideals. And the base wasn't able to grow in that manner, because it was based upon one particular person's agenda, as opposed to a conglomeration or a coalition of conservatives, of pro-life, of pro-gun, of pro-low taxes, pro-growth. And there are many Democrats out there who may think that way, but they were just turned off by the demagoguery. And that leads me to the next point of the book that I want to talk about, which is, you talk about in Aristotle's Politics. He talks about there are two perils that particularly tempt the Democratic, and that's small d, Democratic statesman. One of them is the demagogue, and the other is the ideologue. So talk about that for us.
All right, let's talk about these two logs, the demagogue and the ideologue. The demagogue literally means leader of the people, and that sounds like a good thing, but it's not. If someone calls you a demagogue, that's not a compliment. So when we meet, the demagoguery can be defined in two ways. I'm stealing this from a great political scientist, a student of presidential rhetoric, Jeffrey Tulis, and that is, there's hard demagoguery and soft demagoguery. Soft demagoguery, a soft demagogue is someone who flatters the people, who tells the people whatever they want to hear. And if we all look into our souls, we have certain unhealthy parts of we all want things that we shouldn't have, right? And it might be something as simple as that extra donut, or I'm going to watch one more episode of my favorite show on Netflix instead of do my work, that sort of thing. And of course, what a good friend or a good family member, say a good parent, does is they often will tell us no, right? Even though you want this thing, it's not good for you. The answer is no, you can't have that, or you shouldn't have that. Let me talk to you why this thing is bad for you. And so
Right.
a political leader who says to you, no, have that donut. No, watch that extra TV show, right? Do this thing that's really a waste of your time, but it'll make you feel good. Someone who tells you that's not good. And so these things that we want, it's easy to see this, things like free college for everybody. Doesn't that sound great? I love it when people get things and I don't have to pay for it. The problem is, I use that example because I'm a college professor. I can tell you, I do not work for free. So somebody's going to have to pay me. So there actually is no such thing as free college. There's just college paid for by other people. Because these lights on in my office aren't on for free. Someone's got to pay for it. But that's telling someone what they want to hear. I'd say with Mr. Trump, I think actually I might use this example in the book. When you tell people that we're going to have a wall on the southern border, very plausible, and that the Mexicans are going to pay for it. Not really plausible. The Mexicans were never going to pay for it, but then we get this thing and we don't have to pay for it. That sounds great. Well, that's soft demagoguery. Hard demagoguery is demagoguery that succeeds by exploiting the anxieties, the fears, maybe even the bigotries in people. Again, most of us, if we look into our souls, we all have these things to some amount, right? We look amongst our friends or coworkers, and we see someone who maybe has more money than we do, and they drive a nicer car than we do, and they seem to have life so easy, and that a little part of our brain says, "I hate you," right? And what most of us do is that goes through our heads, and we go, "Whoa, stop! That's not a good thought, right? I have to control. That's envy." Right? I have to control that. That's not healthy.
Right.
Again, what if someone comes to me and says, no, hate that person, right? Indulge in that. It feels good to be mad at these people. Why don't you indulge it? Now let me give you 3 more reasons why you should hate that person, right? And we can sort of see this sometimes, even though, in general, I'm sort of have been with President Trump on immigration. But sometimes when he talks about immigration, he does so in a way where he plays to what are often reasonable fears, reasonable anxieties about how do we stay united as a people when we have large amounts of immigrants coming into our country. That's a reasonable fear. But then that can be exploited for political gain. It's a reasonable anxiety that large amounts of immigration are going to cost jobs and lower wages. I think that's reasonable. But that then can be used to whip up fear about people, especially when we use maybe very heightened rhetoric. But of course, I think the best example of this is Hillary Clinton saying Trump supporters are a bunch of irredeemable deplorables. That's indulging her side in that it's good to not like these people, right?
Yeah.
And it makes me feel good, right? We all know that feeling. It's not a positive thing. It's not a good thing, but we all know that sometimes it feels good to not like somebody and kind of indulge that, but a healthy person in a healthy society tries to contain that. What a demagogue does is pokes the bear. No, you should feel this. And that's the danger of the demagogue. The danger of the ideologue is, ideologue coming from ideology. Now we have progressive ideology, conservative ideology, and that's not quite what I'm talking about. What I mean though is on both of those sides is, the root obviously is idea. I have an idea of what reality should look like, and I try to cram reality into my idea, right? Instead of taking the world as it is and being realistic about things, I try to reconstruct the world based on my idea of what abstract justice should look like. And that's a very immoderate way of viewing things because I say politics has got a lot of balance to it. You know, anybody who's involved in any kind of practical politics knows it's a life of half loaves. And what you're hoping for is to get 3/4 loaves, right? A little bit more on my side. And if you're looking for the whole loaf all the time because you think reality needs to exactly match your idea of what justice is, and I'm not going to compromise until I get everything I want, you're never going to get anything done. You're going to be very comfortable in your motives, and you're going to be very lonely, right? The example I give in the book is if you're sitting there waiting around for the perfect spouse, you're going to be real old and real lonely. We all know that, I'm a married man. I am not perfect. My wife did not pick the perfect man, and I love my wife, but she's not perfect either. And if we were both sitting, waiting around, waiting for the perfect somebody, that was never going to happen. If you're sitting around waiting for the perfect politician, the perfect idea, the perfect bill, it's never going to happen. And so we can't let that idea of the perfect get in the way. And because it gets in the way of the notion, what is so central to democratic governance is compromise. And I don't mean like weasel words or give up completely on your ideals. And one of the things I say about Lincoln, about statesmanship and prudence, is you can compromise. What you don't do is cut off avenues that in the future we might do better. So if you and I, JR, think we should have less regulation, right? I'm not going to sit here and wait for the perfect deregulation bill. If I can get something, I'll take that, right?
Right.
And the idea that I'm also not going to do anything that cuts off, say, future presidents or future Congresses from deregulating more. But if I can get, a bill that gives me 60% of what I want, I'm not gonna reject that because there's some stuff in there I don't like. And then frankly, this is one of the things that Democrats over time have done very well. They take, 60% of a loaf, 60% of a loaf, 60% of a loaf. And over the course of 30 years, next thing you know, they got the whole dang loaf. But because they were willing to say, let's do a little bit at a time, little bit at a time, little bit of a time, little bit of a time. And so next thing you know, we're talking seriously about public options and single payer healthcare systems. That's because the people have been conditioned a little bit of the time. And one of the things I think Republicans don't do as well is, we let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And instead of, looking for that perfect bill, and if we can't get everything we want, we're just going to reject it, instead of saying, if you get 4 bills in a row that are 60% of what you want, you're at like 90%. And that, in politics, that's doing pretty darn good.
And no question about it. And I'll have to take as a personal aside, there are people, Professor, who consider me to be an ideologue. No question. Yeah. They say, JR, you're an ideologue. And I have had to question that. I've had to evaluate that. And there is some truth to that, because I do take reality and I do want to shove it into my idea of what is a worldview, or what I believe is to be true. And I can use the Constitution as a means by which that identifies this, because I believe that my idea is that we take the Madisonian view, the founders' view of the Constitution, the separation of powers and the checks and balances, and only applying the enumerated rights that are within the articles to the institution of government. And of course, that has been completely convoluted now with the infiltration of progressivism and changing all 3 groups. So, as an ideologue, I still maintain my idea, my Madisonian view of government, but yet I have to work within the realization, rather, that it's going to be a slow, deliberate process to bring it back to where we need to get, because so many people don't believe in the initial intent of the Constitution. Am I right?
Yeah. Well, let's use a Lincoln example.
Right.
So Lincoln obviously was anti-slavery. But Lincoln, in some way, I would call him an anti-slave moderate, not in the middle of the road sense, but in the way I'm talking about. And so Lincoln did not believe that you could eradicate slavery in the states where it already existed because it thought it had legal protection. Those legal protections might have been ultimately unjust, but nonetheless, they were there. And also, he had to deal with the fact that public opinion was not entirely on his side. Why is it like, for example, in Illinois, sometimes some people who don't like Lincoln, especially on the left, they often point out the fact that Lincoln was not the perfect egalitarian. So in his debates with Douglas, Stephen Douglas, he was hesitant to call for complete, total social and political equality. Right?
Right.
Well, why? Because in 1850s in Illinois, it was a horribly racist state. It was anti-slavery, but it was racist. For example, it was literally illegal for Black people to move to the state of Illinois. The state of Illinois had passed a law, there should be no Black immigration into our state.
Right.
Right. So what good does it do Lincoln to say, I'm for, now he would often couch it in sort of equivocal words. He wouldn't say I'm against it, but he also wouldn't say I'm for total equality. What he would say is it's beside the point, right? What I do know is in the right to earn his daily bread, to own his labor, the Black man is my equal. So slavery's wrong, right? So he was willing to put these things to, some of these things that he may have even believed, which I think he did, in total political and social equality, to the side, because here's the first step. The first step, step one, stop slavery from expanding. He didn't even say get rid of slavery. He said stop it from expanding. Only after that
Right.
can we start looking at, now how do we roll back slavery? After you do that, now you can start thinking about, now how do we incorporate, at this point you theoretically have free slaves, how do we incorporate them into social and political equality in the American people, right? And so
Right.
whether, he had an idea. So he was an ideologue, so to speak, like you are, JR, and that he had an idea of justice. But he knew as a practical politician, right, you can only go as fast as public opinion says. I may have said this in a previous discussion, but I would say a statesman needs to be 2 steps ahead of the people, but he can't be 10 steps ahead of the people, right?
That's right.
So a good politician has to be a little bit ahead of public opinion, but you get too far ahead of public opinion and you're not going to get anywhere. Again, you might be pure in your principles, but you're going to have, no representation in Congress. You can't win an election sometimes. And so we have to recognize that, even though we might have these very strong convictions, maybe that's a better way of put it. It's not, an ideology, but strong convictions. But as we enter reality, and this is what the prudent moderate statesman does, is know when to insist. And are there certain things that we absolutely do not compromise? A politician in my life that I've greatly admired was Henry Hyde. And Henry Hyde once said that every politician should have at least one issue that they're willing to lose re-election over. And I believe that there's at least one thing that you lose your seat over, that you won't compromise on. But even, it's about, advancing the ball. So if we believe in constitutional Madisonian government, I hate to tell you, but I don't think we're a majority, JR, right? So we need to find what are ways that we can advance the ball without cutting off the idea that, cutting off any avenue of future success. No, we can't get everything we want in the next year, maybe even in the next 10 years. Maybe, this is probably a generational thing, a generational project to bring the American people around to a more modest, and we would, I think we probably would agree, a more constitutional and Madisonian view of American government, because, we've had 100 years of going in one way, shape, or form in the other direction, and you're not going to turn that around in one election cycle. It's just not going to happen.
Right. I want to give you a specific example of how I believe that I and the Constitutional Republicans have exercised moderation on the issue of abortion, which is very similar in my estimation to the atrocity and injustice of slavery. And we believe that, first of all, that the court that the Supreme Court should recognize the inviolability of the life of the child from conception, and thereby protecting the sanctity, the sacrosanctness of human life. At the same time, give those decisions back to the states that once had abortion laws that were taken away by Roe v. Wade, which made it federal, the woman's right to have an abortion, and give it back to the states and let them decide on what they want to do with extenuous circumstances, all sorts of different conditions that could apply for an abortion and so forth, that now only make up a fraction of the reason why women get abortions. Yep. Women get abortions because of inconvenience. 93%, the Guttmacher Institution has come out with statistics showing that. That is an atrocity, and it's a violation of the natural right to life, which of course is the first right. So there's an example where we believe the court should establish the inviolability of the life of the child from conception, and then give it back to the states to what they decide what they want to do as far as abortion laws. So that means that New York and New Jersey and California are probably going to vote to continue to give abortions, but they must recognize that, yes, the child is a human being from the moment of conception. There can be no doubt about it. Science is proving this every day. And so there's an example of what I would believe is a Lincolnian approach to abortion. Would you agree?
Yeah, in fact, if people are curious, there's a recent article on the website Public Discourse of various, there are 3 different authors giving, not unlike what you just said, a Lincolnian. They straight out cite Lincoln approach to abortion, and this is precisely, again, if you're on the pro-life side, as you are, I am, recognizing that, especially if you've got very strong convictions, maybe public opinion, I think public opinion is more on the pro-life side than a lot of people want to admit, but it's not totally on our side. And so what can the goal is, how can you protect human life in a society where there are a lot of people who disagree with us, right? So I'd say it's I don't want to belabor the metaphor, but moving that ball forward, how can you increase protections for human life? And so in my state, some years ago in South Dakota, we had a bill that was it was a ballot measure that was actually going to ban all abortions, but it had exceptions for rape and incest. Well, I knew pro-life people who voted no on that because, well, how can I give those exceptions? Those babies are human lives too if they're conceived in rape and incest. And then you think, well, you could have banned 90. Now, I think that this would have been overturned by the Supreme Court, frankly. But nonetheless, you could have banned 90% of abortions in South Dakota, but because you couldn't ban 100%, you voted no. And that's a kind of imprudence. And that's, again, an example from Lincoln. After in the 1844 election, there was a party called the Liberty Party. It was an anti-slave party. And it took just enough votes away from the major party anti-slave candidate, Henry Clay of the Whig Party, that it almost certainly cost Clay the election, and a pro-slavery president, James Polk, got elected. And Lincoln wrote to Liberty Party leaders saying, I hope you guys like what you did, right? You voted for the more pure anti-slavery candidate and the Liberty Party candidate instead of Henry Clay, because Henry Clay was one of these, sounds weird to our day, anti-slavery slaveholder, because Clay did have slaves.
Great mentor to Lincoln as well.
Yep. So the Liberty Party refused to support him. Well, now look what you reap what you sow. And now you've got a pro-slavery James Polk as president, and I'm glad that Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and California are part of our union, but we fought a whole Mexican war in an attempt to expand slavery, brought about by James Polk, a war that Lincoln opposed. And so he's saying, see, this is what you try to be pure as a driven snow, and what you actually did is you gave the other side, the pro-slavery side, a victory because the anti-slavery people couldn't compromise, and one small party wanted to go faster than public opinion was going to could hold, and it cost the more moderate anti-slave candidate in Henry Clay the election. And so was that a victory for the anti-slave people to have pro-slavery James Polk as president? Well, I don't think so.
Right. Well, that's a excellent discussion we're having, Professor. We're going to wind up, but I just want to tickle our audience's fancy a bit to talk about just a moment before we conclude about the next chapter, which is Lincoln and the defense of natural rights. Now, in the book, the previous chapter, we're talking about how important it is for the statesman to influence the society. Lincoln talked about he who holds the public sentiment will hold the day. I'm paraphrasing, but he was accentuating the importance of public sentiment and how we have to influence. And now that the Republican Party now needing new leadership, now we must go about effectively shaping and informing the public sentiment and public opinion. And of course, what Lincoln did was he went back to the Declaration of Independence in shaping the public opinion on the validity of slavery. And so talk about how he brought that about. And incidentally, and I wanted to share with the audience that we have indeed the Constitutional Republicans, New Jersey Constitutional Republicans. You can see this video pinned to the top of our Facebook group page. We put together a platform since there was no party platform in 2020. It was just moved over from 2016, according to the people who Donald Trump gave that task to, as opposed to getting the job done. They punted the football, in my estimation. But I believe it's important for Republicans to know exactly what we believe. And the very first principle, and I want you to talk about Lincoln and the Declaration, but the very first platform principle is what we say here. I quote from our platform: hereby acknowledge that the purpose of American government from the local, state, and federal levels is derived from the principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence, being the recognition of the laws of nature and nature's God, the equality of all mankind before God and natural law, the unchanging God-given natural rights of life, liberty, and property, the consent of those governed, guaranteeing the government's responsibility in solely securing the rights of those governed. So we, like Lincoln, looking back to the Declaration of Independence is the foundation by which to begin to influence public sentiment.
So Lincoln said that he never had a political feeling that did not emanate from the Declaration of Independence. And so, the subtitle of the book, when he said, "All hail to Jefferson." The subtitle of my book is "The Limits of Liberal Democracy." And probably the central limit is that of natural rights. That no matter how much we value consent and the will of the people, there are certain things that the people cannot justly consent to, and that is limited by natural rights. And so part of the job of Lincoln as a statesman is to use, I think, his powers of poetry, which he had in high amounts, and I think this is, I think, really maybe the great, there are a lot of great achievements of Lincoln. Maybe this is the great one, is to take natural rights ideas and turn them into a kind of poetry, to revivify within the people this dedication to natural right. And that most obviously implicates the institution of slavery, that it doesn't matter if people vote for slavery. It doesn't matter if the people want slavery. It is a natural injustice. Now, as we've been talking about a lot of this show, how you go about doing that, and also given that slavery already existed, you can't wish it away. How do you go about eradicating it is one question. But again, here we're talking about conviction. Here's one conviction Lincoln never gave up, was that he did not want to give up the notion that slavery is a violation of natural right. And no matter what we do, we've got to hold strong to that conviction. And there was no broking of compromise on that notion that slavery is wrong, and it's wrong because it's a violation of natural right. So every human being endowed by their creators simply by virtue of being human. It's not given to you by governments. It's not given to you by law. You have a certain dignity, and that dignity by justice. Our declaration says, right after it talks about right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, it says, and to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So the purpose of government, according to the Declaration of Independence, is to secure our natural rights. Again, how it goes about doing that is it can be a matter of some controversy, but that is the very purpose of government. And at the heart of Lincoln's disagreement with Stephen Douglas is Stephen Douglas thought in the territories, right? Not states yet, but under federal control, we should just let people vote slavery in or out, whether they liked it or not, or
popular sovereignty,
whether we liked it or not. Yeah, that's popular sovereignty, right? Leave it up to the people of Kansas Territory. If they want to have slavery, they can have it. If they don't. So this is what he called the "don't care" policy. I don't care whether they voted up or down. The most important thing to me is that the people have their say. And Lincoln simply said, slavery is as an offense to natural right. If we've got a place where slavery does not exist, we should not introduce it, right? If it already exists, then that's a different question, like say in southern states. But if we've got a place where it doesn't exist, we should resist, and we should resist this notion that something as fundamental as natural right, of which slavery is a violation, that something like that would be held up to a vote. And so I cannot rightly consent to be enslaved. There are all sorts of things that we as a people, or even we as individuals, cannot justly consent to because they are a violation of nature. And that is fundamental to democracy, because it's what makes, Lincoln called the Declaration of Independence the axioms of American democracy. Because if we treat the human person as someone who can be played with, whose dignity is up to the vote of the majority, then that subverts the whole purpose of democracy in the first place, and it stops being a decent democracy that does what democracies are supposed to do, as I just said from the Declaration, protect our rights, and really just becomes a kind of majority tyranny as individuals simply become subjects of power, right? Because that's what Douglas's popular sovereignty is saying, is that power wins the day, not just, so as Lincoln said, right makes might, not the other way around. It's not right makes right, it's right makes might. So you got to be on the right side.
That's exactly right. And of course, we're going to get into this more in depth with our next conversation, which will be on December the 4th. Friday, December the 4th, we'll be back with Professor Schaff. He's written this book, Abraham Lincoln's Statesmanship. Hold up your book, Doctor. Professor. Get yours. There's. I want the cover to that book. There's the book that you want to buy. We've been talking about it. We're going to continue to talk about it. I really appreciate your time, Professor. It's always good to talk to you, and I believe that people are enjoying these conversations and they're learning. Please share. I hope our audience will share this information with people as we look to restore the initial principles of the Republican Party. And Professor Schaff has done a great job in giving us a template and a foundation by which to work with in doing that honorable task.
Thank you, Professor,
again.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Stay warm out there in South Dakota.
I'll try. I'll try.
And we'll look forward to seeing you on December the 4th.
Can't wait. I'll see you then.
Thank you very much. And remember, as Lincoln said, everyone, liberty for all. Thank you.